Thanks so much. Hi, everyone. It's great to see you all again. It's great to be learning with you. I'm just going to let you know right now, I'm probably going to say Ashrei at some point, and I never mean Ashrei. I always mean Aleinu. It's just like around Shavuot, I say Sukkot. It's whatever one's closest, that's the one I mean. So I just get confused with the letters. So I'm happy to be talking with you about Aleinu. I actually wrote a piece on my Jewish learning about Aleinu a while back, and I'm sure Julia put it in the chat, and I included it on the PDF of the resources. But I really love Aleinu. And, it's a shame that because of time, a lot of congregations have truncated it and only say the first part, which is, funnily enough, the most problematic part. And we skip over the second part, which I think is the really rich and meaningful part. Well, not to say that the first part isn't meaningful, but the second part for me really relies on the first part really relies on the second part. And I think they're pretty inseparable. So that's what we're going to explore today. We're going to look at the history of Aleinu, which it's old. So we're going to go way back in time and do a deep dive. And then we're going to look at those two stanzas and understand what they mean, understand what I think they mean. And then we'll look at some of the revisions, some of the changes, some of the tweaks that have been made to the text of Elenu, to the liturgy in the modern day. All right, so let us jump in. I'm just gonna share my screen first. Okay. All right. Okay. Can everyone see my screen? All right. So I thought a good place to start was with an arc of our prayer service, an arc of the Jewish prayer service. And forgive me if someone else has already done this in a session, but I think it's helpful to understand where where Aleinu comes in the arc of the service. So I've color coded it, and I actually learned of this. I believe I learned it from Rabbi Sheffa Gold. So this might be like a precursor of what's to come next week when you do Shechianu with her. So pretty much every service has this same arc. There are some things that are put in, some things that are moved around, but this is pretty much the shape of the service. We start out over here with Birkot HaShachar, and Birkot HaShachar is green, and the green things, there's only two, they help us start to think about the physical, and they engage our earthly and our worldly senses. So when we are doing Birkot HaShachar, we're blessing for opening our eyes, and blessing for having clothes, and blessing washing our hands, and doing all of these like really physical activities. And then it ascends towards Psuke de Zimra, our verses of song, which those are responsive, right? The Psuke de Zimra engage our emotions and how we respond to the environment, how we respond to the divine through song, through exaltation, all of those feelings. Then we keep going up to the Shema and the blessings that are around the Shema. And this part of the service is really the intellectual part of the service that really engages our mind. And how do we think about God? How do we think about our relations to other people? You have the first blessing, which talks about like the God of the cosmos. If it's morning or night, it's still like, it's the God of the cosmos that makes day and night and is so big and so huge. And then the second blessing is, the God that's my personal God, and how either like Ahavat Olam or Ahava Rabbah. And how do I engage with that image, that understanding of the divine? And of course, the Shema, the oneness of the divine. What does that mean? That really challenges us, which we've built up the foundation on these other two sections of like checking in with our emotions and checking in with the physical realm around us. And then we ascend to the top of the arc, which is the Amidah. right? The central prayer, the time there's silence, there's no words. All of this has words, lots and lots of words. But the Amidah is silent. I mean, there's words, we're saying them silently, but it's the transcendent time of our service that engages the soul. And in that silence, it's a very pregnant silence in the sanctuary. If we can remember, well, those feelings of being in the sanctuary. We just at TBZ at Temple Beth Zion, we just had our first back in person Shabbat services, and like the moment of the Amidah was so pregnant with that transcendent energy. It was really wonderful. So then we start coming down the other side of the arc, and it's Torah service, or oftentimes there's a Devar Torah, depending on, what service it is, or just the Bissel Torah. It doesn't have to be like a full sermon. Sometimes people do it over here if it's a nighttime service between Mincha and Mariv, but usually Torah is happening over here. Again, it's intellectual, it's engaging our mind. How do we think about the words that we're hearing? How do we understand this? And after Torah service and all that comes with it, we come back to Aleinu. And Aleinu, as you can see, it's yellow. So it's something that engages our emotions, right? How do we feel about the divine connection? How do we feel about the world that we're living in? What do we yearn for? And then after that, we go back into the physical realm. It's like the stop right before getting back into the physical and getting ready to say goodbye, and Adon Olam and our closing songs. And really, I would put announcements right here. That should probably be purple, because that's like the most sacred part of the service, according to the presidents usually. But then we close the service here with Adon Olam. So I'm gonna stop my share about the arc of the service, and really it's just certainly not in depth, but just a quick run through to help you understand where Elenu is. So and we're going to just do this history before we get into the text of Elenu. Let me just make sure I have my history page up. Okay, so Elenu, it's old. I mean, the great thing about our tradition is that most things are old. Some people attribute it to Joshua, and we'll talk about why. And that's based on a few comparable lines to what we have for the Elenu text for the liturgy. But most people attribute it to Rav in the Talmud. Rav, who's also known as Abba Aricha or Rav Abba Bar Ebo, and that's 3rd century Babylonia. So we're talking specifically Talmud Bavli. I know some people know we have 2 Talmuds. This is the Talmud Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud. And he's believed to have written the beginning of the Malchuyot section of the Rosh Hashanah Musaf service. So that's the home of Aleinu. Aleinu is not originally found at the end of every single service. Aleinu's original location was in the beginning of the Malchuyot service of those 3 parts of the Rosh Hashanah Musaf, Malchuyot, Zikronot, and Shofarot, Malchuyot being the first. Which means since it's a part of Musaf, a part of the Amidah, which explains why we're standing for Aleinu. And so I want to take a look at Aleinu on Rosh Hashanah, which is also called the Grand Aleinu. And it's probably called the Grand Aleinu because, we now have a regular, ordinary Aleinu, so we have to differentiate this with our Grand Aleinu. And it's like the highest part of our Rosh Hashanah service, because Musaf is already a very valuable, high desired Amidah, or sacrifice, if we're talking about the sacrifices for which the prayers were made against. We have our regular everyday offerings that we do, our everyday prayers, but Musaf is the additional one. Musaf we do because we love God, because we desire more time for God, because we desire to be more in God's presence. So it's like all the more so on Rosh Hashanah, on our holiest day of the year. And of course, that can be contended, but Rosh Hashanah for most is like the holiest day of the year. And it's also based on a Babylonian coronation ceremony where the Babylonians would crown their new kings. We are crowning God as our king, ruler, master, that energy that is controlling, is ordaining, is creating order within the cosmos and the world in which we live. So that's what's happening on Rosh Hashanah. And then we get to the Musaf service, which is already to say, we've crowned you and we love you even more. And there's this part called Malchuyot, which is all about God as divine, God as ruler, God as sovereign. And this is an Aleinu, the text as we know it, is the beginning, more or less, of that section. So I'm trying to think of what else is important. Oh, so when we get to the part in Elenu, when we bow, that we bow and we give thanks. On Rosh Hashanah, I'm not sure if this is the practice in the congregations that you're familiar with, but it is the practice to physically prostrate. It's the only time of year that we actually get down on our knees and we put our heads, our foreheads touching the ground in a position that we usually associate with Islam. But that's part of the grand Aleinu, that we are really literally bowing down to the one God that we believe in and we hold. It's like a really intense time. So where did this come from? I love being like a sleuth in our tradition to understand who wrote this. When did we start doing this? Where did this even come from? Well, it's notable to mention that neither Amram Gaon, who is attributed with the first Siddur, the first order of our prayer services, setting that order in the 9th century, nor Rambam, 12th century, Abduraram, the 14th century, or the Shulchan Aruch, which is around the 16th century. And the Shulchan Aruch is also important because it's like the modern foundation of our halacha. None of those texts or people mention reciting Aleinu on a daily basis, or even in any of our services outside of Rosh Hashanah, Musaf, like we just talked about. So like, where did it come from? When did it start? Well, in the 12th century, this is like the earliest text that has Aleinu outside of Rosh Hashanah is something called Machzor Vitri, which was written in France, and it included Aleinu as a part of daily shacharit. And some people believe that it was instituted as a daily rejection of Christianity. Why? What else was going on around the 12th century? The Crusades, right? So some believe that this was put in as a zetz towards Christianity. And in fact, some people have cited that some martyrs in France, the same place where Machzor Vitri is from, they were reciting Aleinu as they were dying, as they were being martyred. So there is this deep connection to the Crusades and Elenu. And it doesn't stop there, unfortunately. So in 1399, a Jewish apostate, it's like another amazing class to talk about. I'll put it in a box for now, but talking about Jewish apostates in the Middle Ages is a fascinating class. And Julie, I'm going to send you some resources, because it's like, I did a session on this once and it really changed it really made me think about things differently. Anyways, so a particular Jewish apostate began denouncing Aleinu as an attack on Christianity. And of course, then it led to a lot of Jewish murders and a lot of Jewish martyrs. And there are particular lines in Ashrei that we'll go over that were that were deeply offensive to the church. And specifically, there's one verse that we'll go over. For they bow to vanity and emptiness and pray to a God which helps not. And we'll go into that in a moment. But that that experience in the Middle Ages led to, as I said, the attribution of Aleinu to Joshua. Because if the church was saying, well, this is an attack on Jesus and an attack on Christianity, the response is, no, no, no. This text is much older than this. This text is actually attributable to Joshua, right at the time of going into the land of Israel. So it's not a problem, and it's not what you think it is. So that's where we get those two lines of attribution. Okay. So let's jump into Elenu so that we can put some of this history in context. Da, da, da. Let me find Elenu. Here we go. Okay. And oh, I see Abigail has a question. Sure, because we're about to switch gears. Abigail, what's your question? I'll stop share for a second.
Abigail, you're muted. You can unmute yourself. Or maybe it was a slip of the hand, the raised.
Okay. All right. And we'll have time for questions at the end. No worries. All right, let me go back into my screen share. All right, Elenu, it's on us. Okay, so as I said before, there's like two main parts of Elenu, and I really like this Venn diagram that is not actually affiliated with Elenu, but I saw it somewhere and I was like, oh my gosh, this is exactly what Elenu is talking about. The first half, the first stanza, it's not really a stanza, the first part of Elenu talks about our unique talents, skills, and gifts, both as individuals and as the Jewish people. And the second stanza, the second part, brings us to think about what breaks your heart most about this world, what is really deeply challenging. And of course, with the Venn diagram, the sweet spot is in the middle, where you are now being called to be in service, right? And so that middle spot where you're being called, for me, I think that's why, you know, Elenu is in that yellow zone, right? That Elenu is calling on is pulling on our emotional response, right? Because that's what drives us into action. There are plenty of things that we know intellectually and still do the opposite of. You know, like back in the day, there are people who, and still there are people who, no judgment, people who smoke cigarettes, knowing, right, cigarettes cause lung cancer and like all the terrible things, but like the intellectual knowledge isn't going to stop people from things. There has to be something deeper. And I really know, I do all kinds of Michigan things that I know that like intellectually I shouldn't be doing, but again, there's like, we're humans. So this is where Elenu falls for us. It pulls on our emotions. I'm going to move this over here because I can't see you with the Zoom box there. All right, I'll lead us in the Hebrew. Let me just move my Zoom box one more time. Aleinu l'shabeach la'adon hakol, latet gedula leotzer breshit, shelo asanu kegoyei ha'aratzot, velo samanu kemishpachot ha'adama, shelo sam chelkenu kahem, וגהור עלינו ככל המונם, שהם משתחווים להבל וריק, ומתפללים אל אלוה יושיע, ואנחנו קוראים ומשתחווים ומודים לפני מלך מלכי המלכים, הקדוש ברוך הוא. Next part. Shehu notei shamayim veyosed haaretz umoshav yekaro v'shamayim mima'al u'shchinatu zo begovhei meromim hu Eloheinu ein od emet malkeinu efes zulato Kakatuv betorato ve'adata yom v'hashevota elevavecha ki Adonai hu ha'Elohim b'shamayim mima'al ve'al ha'aretz mitachat ein od. So that's the first chunk. And in English, let's walk through this. Aleinu, it's our duty. Literally, it's on us to praise, l'shabeach, la'adon hakol, to praise literally the master of everything. And this harkens back to Adon Olam, actually, right? Because in the beginning of Adon Olam, it says, oh my goodness, how does it start out? La'et nasa b'chefzo kol azai melech shemo nikra. As soon as, at that moment when everything was created as God wanted it, azai melech shemo nikra. In that moment, God was called Melech, which translates as king or ruler. Here we're talking about master. La'adon hakol, Adon olam. Latet gedula le'otzer breshit. To acclaim the greatness of the one who forms all creation. Shelo asanu kegoyeh ha'aratzot. Now here we're getting into the things that really challenge people about reciting Ashrei. For God did not make us like the nations of other lands, velo samanu kimishpachot ha'adama, and didn't make us the same as other families of the earth. And you can imagine it as a person who's not Jewish coming into a Jewish space, what these words might sound like, how this might resonate for someone who's unfamiliar. And there's the next part. Hold on one second, I lost my place. Shelo sam chelkenu kahem. God didn't place us in the same situations as others. V'gorelenu kechol hamonam. And our destiny is not the same as anyone else's. Right, so through the years, these have been understood as both nationalistic and lifting up the Jewish people over other people. And that's what's led to, and especially this next part, which we're going to come to, that's what led to a lot of the martyrdom especially around and after the Crusades, especially the real Middle Ages, like the 1400s, and even through until I think 1703 was the last. But I think that was like the last time Elenu was invoked as a reason to kill Jews. So this is it's very serious, especially this next part here. And I put it in italics because you may never have heard it before. It is not a part, it has been removed from Elenu for most non-Orthodox congregations. I think even, I'm trying to, no, the Orthodox congregations that I've been to still have this line in. The Sidurim that we were using still have this line in, and we said it. So let's go into this. Shehem mishtachavim lehevel v'reik. Umitpalelim el lo yoshia, for they bow to hevel v'reik, to vanity and emptiness. You remember Kohelet says, hevel hevelim, right? So like this vanity, this nothingness, this superficiality, v'reik and emptiness. Umitpalelim, and they pray to a God who cannot save. So there's just so much in here. How much time do we have? Just check okay, I'm doing okay. So one thing you may notice about Aleinu so far is that it has this parallelism. It's very poetic. It's our duty to praise the master of all, to acclaim the greatness of the one who forms all creation, right? Like the second verse or the second half parallels the first. For God didn't make us like nations of the other lands and did not make us like all the other families of the earth, right? The end parallels the beginning. So when we look at this, it's very similar. And literally a word for word, someone took issue with Yoshia and Rake. So, Mit Palalim El Lo Yoshia sounds very much like Yeshu, which is Jesus in Hebrew. And so it sounds very much like it is a zetz towards Christianity, right? They're praying to a God who can't save, whose name also sounds a lot like this word for, that we're saying. But also thinking of the gematria, and this one was like really complicated. We talked about parallelism. So if we're going to say the end of the first part is right here, is Rake would be compared to here Yoshia. The gematria of Rake is 316, which is the same as the gematria of Yeshu, of Jesus's Hebrew name. So the argument was, well, that word, that like they'll understand that Rake actually stands for Jesus, and that's offensive, right? So that's the understanding, or the belief, I should say, that led to the church with a capital C running a death campaign on Jews on account of Aleinu. So in response, certainly this line was excised from the text. Then the attribution to Joshua, like we talked about earlier, came about. And it's based on some textual similarities that you can look at. I think I put the citation in the extra resources. Yeah. And then it continues. Va'anachnu korim, and so like that's the comparison, right? Like they're doing all this stuff, but we are bowing down. Umishtachavim umodim, we're bowing down and worshiping and giving thanks. Lifnei melech malchem lachim hakadosh baruch hu, to the ruler of all rulers, the Holy One, blessed is God. Right? We're setting up obviously this comparison between peoples. And now we've just introduced this concept of God. Now we're going to elaborate on who this God is. The one who spread out the heavens and made the foundations of the earth, and whose precious dwelling is in the heavens above, and whose powerful presence is in the highest heights. Adonai is our God. There is none else, no other God. Our God is truth, and nothing else compares, as it is written in your Torah. And you shall know today and take to heart that Adonai is the only God in the heavens above and on earth below. There is no other. That's the whole first stanza for you. And I just want to point out there are footnotes here, as most everything in our Siddur is either taken from somewhere is usually taken from somewhere in Tanakh. I left for you the citations to find the exact location. And I highly recommend looking at these source texts in their context to understand what they mean in context, and then what they mean here in Elenu, and how the writer is bringing in that context to give it a fuller meaning. In fact, that's something that we should always do if we have the time, God willing, to look at the sources in their context to understand what it meant for the writers and what they're trying to create by using those specific texts here. Okay, so how do we understand this? When I read this, and this is just my understanding and what I've read in modern commentaries, and not to erase all of this history that's on these words, because it's very serious right? We can't just say, well, I understand this differently now, right? Because a lot of people have lost their lives over centuries for people understanding it the way it's written. But for me, I don't like to take things out of the prayer book that have been charged with meaning. I like to try to understand a meaning that speaks to me in my day. So the way I understand this, and I've offered some other resources here that follow this. Shelo asanu kegoyei ha'aratzot, right? That's where we are. For God did not make us like the nations of other lands, right? Like we are different, right? Like people are different. There is variety and diversity amongst us. Velo samanu kimishpachot ha'adama, right? And like we started out in a homeland. We started out in the land of Israel. We didn't start out dispersed all over the world. We had a sacred container that still connects us to each other. And that this, for me, this beginning connects us to our mythical connection to the land of Israel. And I don't mean that in like mythical in the sense that it's fake, but I mean mythical in that like it's a part of our story and a part of our narrative. Shelo sam chelkenu kahem v'goralenu kechol hamonam, who didn't put our lot amongst anyone else, and didn't put our fate like in the way of anyone else's fate, right? And so when I read this, I think it's not about saying didn't put our lot amongst those other people, because that would be bad, but to say we have a very special job, a very special relationship. And everyone has a special relationship, I should say, but ours is through Torah, ours is through Shabbat, ours is through the Jewish holidays, ours is through our relationship with the land of Israel, right? It can't be replicated, and it belongs to us alone, because this is this relationship belongs to us alone, that this is our history and that belongs to us. And many other peoples have different histories, different connections with God, different relationships to the land of Israel, right? But this is our historical narrative, and this is where we are rooted. So that's how I understand that, with respect and love for the other nations of the world and other peoples of the world, and also valuing the special Jewish relationship with God, with the land, with the world, with Torah, with mitzvot. And then there's this line, Shehem mishtachavim lahevel harek umid pelalim el lo yeshia. That really speaks to me now in the 21st century, when the God has become the almighty dollar. And I see this as I'm trying to think of the English word for zets, like an attack on our consumerist culture, right? And there's, for me, Shehem Mitpalalim Hevel V'Reik, it's like all of Kohelet is talking about like how the things that you can buy with money, that's not the stuff that's important. What's important is relationships, and having relationship with God, and getting to know people, and like having the newest this and the fanciest that, that's not important. So I link that to that text. Umit palalim el lo yoshia. And I see people putting stock and putting faith literally in things that can't save, that won't have salvation. Like, well, if I just, go to this school, if I get this job, if I do this external thing, that's going to save me, instead of having an inner salvation and an inner integrity. So that's my read on these verses and how I daven with them. Ve'anachnu korim, ve'anachnu, and I translate that as like me, and I make the assumption that the people that I'm with are, and that these are core Jewish values. So that we are praying, we are bowing, we are thanking to God, who stands for substance above the the lack of substance. And I think this is pretty straightforward. I'm gonna skip this so that we can get to the next part. Right, there's nothing here. Oh, except for this part that I really want to highlight. This turn that we're doing. So we're saying there is no other, right? Like there's only one God. And then we get to this next part, which is about how there are many other gods right now. So it's just a way of reminding us, and especially in thinking about Aleinu, in our everyday service, we're about to go off into the world, right? We've just had this whole prayer service. We've discussed Torah, we've discussed politics or whatever's going on in the world. We've made those connections. And it's like one last reminder. It's like a pep rally. Don't forget, like we are here because we are serving a God who is above the fanciest house and the nicest car and the newest whatever, but a God that believes in justice and fairness and feeding the sick and all of those values that are so important to our tradition. There is no other. There's nothing else, right? So then we get into Al-Ken. And this is the part that's usually skipped. And actually, sometimes people even skip from, they skip the fun sing-songy part and just go down to V'nei Emar. It's like, wait, that's all of Aleinu. So, Al-Ken, nikaveh lecha Adonai Eloheinu. And so we put our hope in you, Adonai, our God. Lirot mehera b'tiferet uzecha. To see soon the glory of your strength. Lahavir gilulim min haaretz. So this goes back to like, let me translate that, to remove all of the idols of the earth. And gilulim is like a really bad word for idols, but in the way I'm thinking about it, it's like those commercial things that aren't important, that people get distracted by and tempted by when the real path is ahead of us. So it's a prayer that those things will just be wiped out. Those things, not those people who feel that way, those things that distract us from the main mission. Min haaretz v'ha'elilim karut yakare tun, right? And that form of Hebrew is like a very strong, that all false gods will be completely cut off, right? Very strongly. Letaken olam b'malchut Shaddai. So I highlighted this because this is in our liturgy where we see the idea of tikkun olam. But here in Ashrei, it's not people doing tikkun olam. It's God doing tikkun olam. God repairing the world. B'malchut Shaddai, which this translates as your holy empire. And Malchut, we know, or don't know, I'll tell you, Malchut is one of the sphirot, one of the Kabbalistic sphirot. And it's the sphira that is so close and most accessible. So when I read this, I think, letaken olam b'malchut Shaddai. So like God is working to repair the world through the channels of Malchut, by pouring down all what we need into this world for us to be able to access it. So when we're doing tikkun olam, we are doing actually imitatio Dei. We are imitating God and working with God to do tikkun olam. God is doing tikkun olam on a large scale. We're doing tikkun olam in the ways that we are able to, in order to bring all what is needed down into this world. But Malchut Shaddai, and Shaddai is another name for God, and it literally means the breasted one. So we think about suckling children, suckling babies who are able to just get whatever nutrients they need from their mother's breasts. And what's really, I don't want to get too scientific, but I just find this completely mind-blowing, is that as the baby is nursing, the body is sensing the saliva that's coming back in to analyze how the baby is doing, right? To say, oh, do you need more calcium? Do you need more iron? Do you need more vitamin B12, and the breast milk adjusts to give the baby what it needs based on that back and forth. And so that's when I think about Malchut Shaddai, when we're in this space and we are praying to God and God is giving to us. It's this back and forth connection and relationship in order to do this work of Tikkun Olam. And it's so painful this gets skipped, but it is beautiful imagery for us to hold and understand both our partnership with the divine and how we can rely on the divine for the needs that we have in order to do this work of Tikkun Olam. And all living flesh will call your name. And that's really important, that all the wicked of the earth will turn to you, not will be wiped out, right? Like you might think it's like, it would just be so much easier if we just killed all those bad people and then, we wouldn't have the problems. But no, this text believes deeply in teshuva. Teshuva is the way, right? That the ideas, if we wiped out all of those people, the ideas and the beliefs would still linger. We need to go through this process of transformation in order to get to this, what I would call the messianic time, this time of Mashiach, this time when everyone has the same collective idea, the same belief and desire for justice, etc. For all the wicked, I just said that, will turn to you. May all the world's inhabitants recognize and know that to you every knee must bend and every tongue must swear loyalty. Before you, Adonai, our God, may all bow down and give honor to your precious name, and may all take upon themselves the yoke of your rule. Now, what does that mean? Again, this is a little challenging, and I don't think this is necessarily a challenging part between Jews and other people, but this idea of God as a ruler, and what does it mean to take on the yoke of God's rule? And for me, I like to hold this as saying, like, it is so easy to be like crass. It's so easy to not do, it's much easier, I should say, to not do things that make the world better than to do the things that make our world, better, right? Like it's easy for me, this is just like a really simple, silly example, but like it's easy for me to just throw everything in the trash instead of stopping, recognizing my waste and my consumption, putting what needs to be composted in the compost, reusing what I can reuse, recycle what I can't recycle, and putting the leftovers in the trash, right, to go to the landfill. That takes a lot more time, mindfulness, and effort. Right. And so when I think about the yoke, right, it's like it's a burden. It's something that we carry. It's heavy. We don't get to live a light life, right? We have to hold these values in all of our actions. And that's, again, what Elenu is here reminding us, that it should be that everyone is holding these kinds of values, that taking this heaviness upon themselves and making these distinctions in life. May you reign all forever, because your rule is young alone. This is written in your Torah, Adonai Yimloch leolam va'ed. And that is a call from Shirat Hayam, as the Israelites were crossing the sea, right? The moment of ultimate redemption. So right there, after this huge, long, beautiful reminder that it's a prayer that God, help us all get to this one place. We are linked back to the first redemption, the first moment of redemption, when we escaped and were brought out of Mitzrayim. As it says, God will one day be the ruler over all of the earth, and on that day, God will be one, and God's name will be one as well. And I share right here that this is borrowed from the Jewish Virtual Libraries translation. So let me wrap this up really fast. So that's Aleinu, and that's, the words and what they mean and some of the ideas behind them. So how do we grapple? How do we grapple with the difficulties that are in this text? And there are a number of ways. There have been revisions as early as 1672 to the text of Aleinu. And if you want to see what some of those were back in a historical context, I highly recommend visiting My People's Prayer Book, Tachanun and Concluding Prayers. I put that down in the additional resources section, but one of the commentators on Aleinu gives a whole lot of the revisions and additions from the different movements. I offer here a couple of solutions that are, I wouldn't say popular, but that are popular. The first is, I'm going to start with this one because this is, I think, the most well-known. This is in certainly the oldest, in the Reconstructionist Siddur Kol HaNeshama. They offer two alternatives for that first paragraph. Aleinu l'shabeach ladon hakol latet gedula leotzer breshit shenatan lanu Torah emet v'chayei olam nata betochenu, right? Which is part of Torah blessing, and that speaks to that idea of what's different and what makes us Jews and what makes us unique from all the other people is our relationship with Torah and with halakha, right? It's nothing inherent about the Jewish race. It's that we have this Torah as guidance, and that's what that alternative offers up. And there's another one. Let me see if I not choke on the tune of it. Aleinu l'shabeach ladon hakol latet gedula leotzer breshit borei hashamayim v'notehem roka haaretz v'tzetza'eha notei neshama le'am aleha v'ruach l'holchim ba. So for this, I really like because it speaks to the purpose of us. It's on us, not exclusively as Jews, but on us as created beings, right? Because humanity is different from the animals, and all humanity has this charge to make our world more habitable, more sustainable, etc. It's up to us to offer praises to the source of all, to declare greatness to the author of creation, who created heaven's heights and spread out its expanse, who laid the earth's foundation and brought forth its offspring, giving life to all its peoples, the breath of life to all who walk about. And as I said, let me not try to choke on the tune, because we want to use the same tune because we're familiar with the Ashrei tune. So this last text from Rabbi Dan Medwin is in Mishkan HaNefesh, which is the new reform machzor for the high holidays. And it works with the tune without having to make changes. And it also highlights all of those things that we've been talking about for what makes us different and what Aleinu really means. Aleinu l'shabeach ladon hakol latet gedula leotzer breshit shehu asanu l'shomrei ha'adama vehu samanu l'shlichei ha'torah shehu sam chayenu itam vegor aleinu im kol ha'olam. It's beautiful. Our calling is to praise the living source. Our duty is to make known the greatness of the one creator who trusts us to be guardians of the earth, right? That's all people, guardians of the earth, and messengers of Torah, us as Jews, who gives us a destiny shared with all human beings, right? We're all floating on this rock together, and who binds our lives to theirs. So we can't be that separatist. And there are some resources at the bottom if you're interested in learning a little bit more about the history, if you wanted to read a little bit more about what I said about Tikkun Olam, and if you wanted to learn more about Ashrei, Aleinu in general, you can check out this My People's Prayer Book. All right, so that's Aleinu in a super nutshell. I think we have time for questions.
Great. Wow. Thank you so much. That was fantastic. There were some questions I think that went by earlier. We can take a peek at the chat box. I think some new questions are coming in.
All right, let's roll it back. La la la.
And a couple people have raised hands as well.
All right. How about Corey first and Miss B. Mia Reed next. Hi, Corey.
Awesome. Hi, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. That was such a fantastic deep dive into something that I have long wrestled with. So much appreciated. I was wondering if you wouldn't mind speaking about Aleinu and social justice and any thoughts that you have as it relates to using that prayer, it seems like in recent years, to advocate for anything and everything under the sun, electing the right officials, eradicating racism, everything that we're working on as a society. And do we run the risk of overusing it and no longer appreciating its meaning? Or do you think there are enough parallels there to the point where, yeah, use it. Let's keep getting it out there and reminding people it's on all of us collectively.
That's a great question. I think the thrust of social justice is the authentic meaning of the end of Ashrei. So I don't think it's disingenuous to use it and to push it. As to the overuse, I think like we have to bring something new to it every time, right? Like we also say Shir L'Shem Shir Chadash, right? If we're saying the same Aleinu every time, then it's not as strong. But it's on the person who's bringing the text or closing the service or what have you to give a framing that speaks to the moment, that relies on this ancient text, but still connects it to this moment so that the listeners are able to hear the words anew, to hear the charge anew, to respond to the moment and not just like, I heard this last week. Yeah, Miss B. Mia Reed.
Hi, Rabbi Bamaya. So,
Bamaya, thank you, Bamaya.
So I was wondering, when we use the word to save, the Hebrew word does sound a lot like Jesus' name in Hebrew, Yeshua, because it means the same, right? Similarly, that's the meaning of the Hebrew word. That to
Yes,
save.
correct.
Yes, and so, but is that word used in other places on the Siddur? It seems to. Like in the services, when I hear it sometimes, or either it's Saturday morning or Friday, I always like kind of bristle a little bit because of my association, so but I think it's used other places, right? Like
Absolutely. We say Hoshiana, Hoshienu. I'm thinking most recently of Hallel because I was just doing Hallel.
yes.
But yeah, it's very, it is a word that we use all the time that means salvation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I know a lot of people think that that's like a singularly Christian idea, but it's not. Like, it might be now because that's just like the only focus, but it has its roots, in the Hebrew Bible. So I know a lot of people struggle with it, and it makes me sad to know that they took that part of our prayer and were like, oh, are you like trying to slam Jesus? And it's like, no, not actually. He was a good Jewish boy before he went off the rails, So.
Yes. And at the same time, it very well may have been a way of hitting back against Christianity. Because, at the time, Jews were a persecuted people, like we still are. I was just reading one of these comments, it's like that, Jews, every religion lifts themselves up, but Jews seem to suffer the most for it. Oh, that was your comment, right?
Yeah.
So, at the time it would be totally normal to say, I'm going to daven this piece of liturgy that makes me feel less oppressed, that gives me something positive to hold on to and to a way of getting back at, in a little way, the oppressor.
Mhm.
So yeah,
But thank you for bringing that up. Appreciate it.
absolutely.
There's a question from Jonathan in the chat box. In First Steps in Hebrew Prayer by Danny Ben Gigi, I don't know if I'm saying that right, the second line is translated, the second line of the Aleinu, I guess, is translated, to ascribe greatness to the molder of primeval creation. Is this wording seems to be not the same as creator, is a different nuance intended?
I think it's just being quite literal, because Yotzer implies like a hands-on kind of creation, which is juxtaposed with Bria and Bara from the first chapter of Genesis, where God sort of was creating Yesh Mi'ayin, like something from nothing. It was just like, let there be this and let there be that. Whereas with the second creation story, it really uses the word Yotzer and talks about how God is like super present in the creation of the world, that like God is forming it, which Corey actually goes back to what you were saying. In thinking about social justice, it's like God's hands are on this world, if we're using like leaning into Yotzer. So it's like understanding what does that mean, and how do we like use that in our justice work? And to Bereshit, yeah, Le'yotzer Bereshit, to the work of creation. We talk about creation as Ma'aseh Bereshit. So that's a pretty literal translation of Le'yotzer Bereshit, the former of creation.
Is the prayer ever said in the language of the land and not in Hebrew? Many of us are not fluent Hebrew speakers, so we may miss the meaning of the prayer.
Well, there are only certain prayers that are mandated to be said in the language of the land, and Aleinu is not one of them. But it could be said. The only thing is people are so used to singing the song and the tune, and like the high school kids have like boppy bops that they do at certain times. So some people would be like, oh no, if we all of a sudden did it differently. But there's no reason why Aleinu can't be said in English or whatever the language of the land is.